record on this computer. All right, recording in progress. It always sounds like crime in progress. All righty. So if everybody could have out their book or their version of the book now. So just some business stuff. I have been really inundated. This is kind of the big crunch time for me in the semester. I have 2 other classes. Actually, I've got 3 other classes beside you guys, and I'm making headway on the midterms and emails. And I also have 2 papers that I'm presenting for conferences, and I'm trying to wrap them up this week. They will be wrapped up this week because the conference is this week, at the end of this week, which is one reason why we're only meeting 1 time this week. But a couple things. So going forward, we're going to be meeting twice a week for the rest of the semester, number 1. Number 2, I'm going to try to plow through the midterms as fast as I can possibly go, and I'll give you updates on where I am. And particularly if you need to know ASAP, you can touch base with me. Then the other thing is that the final exam, a few people have asked me about the date of the final exam, and I'm going to post that sometime this week. And I will have so for the midterm, I put together that folder with all the various materials in it. And I am going to post the final exam super early, like in the next week or so. It's going to have materials that we haven't all covered. Not everything will have been covered yet, but it will be there just as safekeeping, so you can get started as soon as we start covering that material. And some of the material is going to come from the Odyssey, and some of the material is going to come probably from Othello. I'll have to look at exactly what I want to include, because I tweak it every semester. But I want everybody will have that up early, and also the due date for the exam will be as early as I can put it, just so we can have it out of the way, and you can take care of other things. Next week, and I know I only refer to Monday here, but I can tell you right now exactly what we're going to cover. So next week will be our last week with the Odyssey, and the next Monday, what we're going to focus on are the opening lines of the poem. And of course, we have actually already read them. We're even going to touch on them briefly in a moment again today. But the big thing about these opening lines is that they really encapsulate. They are a kind of microcosm of the entire text, which is to say they're a kind of miniature version of the universe of the whole text. And they have everything in the text in a kind of compressed way, number 1. Number 2, these opening lines provide a kind of roadmap, not only to what happens in the text, but to its central and core themes, right? So if you've started to watch any of these videos dealing with these opening lines, you know what I'm talking about. And I'll touch on it briefly today when we talk about the portrait of human nature in the Odyssey. Odysseus, but not just Odysseus, how the human being is depicted in their psychology, in their motives, in their actions, and so on and so forth. So next Monday, we'll be looking at those opening lines and kind of dissecting some of the central elements of it. And what's important is, as we look at these opening lines, since we'll have read the entire text, we'll be able to put a lot of meat to the bone of those opening lines, which are rather simple and schematic. And we'll start to, the text will say things about their journey. The text thing will say things, that those opening lines will say things about the nature of Odysseus. And having read the whole book, we'll really be able to see what those opening lines really mean in a way that we can't when we first come to the text. That's one thing. The other thing, which is an extension of what I've just said, is that one of the central things the opening lines focus on is, we could say, the concept of the journey and the centrality to the journey of this whole text. And we said in our first class, I think, that Odyssey, the title, literally means the story of Odysseus. But the word naturally has come to mean, in light of the details of that story, an odyssey has come to mean a certain type of journey, precisely because the central focus of the story, the plot, involves a certain type of journey. One of the big things we're going to see in those opening lines is the way in which this journey is both a physical journey, but also a psychological journey. Uh, the journey is to be taken literally, in the sense that Odysseus and his men are physically on a boat going through the seas around Greece, the Aegean, the Mediterranean, and so on and so forth. The wine dark sea, right? But it turns out that their journey in a boat on the ocean turns out to be a kind of a metaphor. So there's not just a literal meaning to this journey, but also a figurative meaning. And that figurative meaning seems to be really bound up with not a physical journey, but a psychological journey. And of course, the focus is Odysseus's psychological journey. And that's something we'll touch on today based on what I hope everybody was able to get to. I asked you to read up through book 20. However, what we're going to focus on today really deals with book 9 and a few other elements, books 10 and 11. So we're not going too deep into it today. Um, and then on Wednesday, we're going to look at the ending of the text, and we'll look at the not the very end, but we'll look at the decisive moments in which the drama that we've been anticipating since the first page of the text finally unfolds. And we'll also look at some other moments of decisive moments when Odysseus returns to Ithaca. And this, the irony of this text is he returns to Ithaca, and then we go from book to book to book to book before the conflict actually gets resolved. There's all this kind of downtime where the drama is kind of slowed down, and the excitement of the journey from Troy is over, but the excitement of addressing the suitors and confronting them has not begun. And it's this kind of period of relative calm. So we'll look at the resolution of the text, and we'll consider some very interesting things that go on there. Because of course, I think we said at the very beginning, the book 1 of the Odyssey, it pretty much tells you what's going to happen. There's going to be a confrontation. He's going to make it back to Ithaca, and there's going to be some type of confrontation with the suitors. And I suppose, given that Odysseus, being who he is, being a hero, we kind of have a hint that he's likely to succeed in dealing with the suitors. And then the question becomes, how exactly does it all unfold, and why does it unfold in the way that it does? Okay, so this week, I want to briefly touch on some materials I provided in the assignment module, in the folder, dealing with the portrait or the picture of human nature that's painted by the Odyssey and Homer. It's important to keep in mind that Homer was understood as the book for the Greeks. The word Bible, right? Does anyone know what the word Bible means? What does the word Bible mean?
Does it mean story?
No, I mean, obviously it has stories in it, which are really important. Anyone know what the word Bible means? It's actually pretty simple. Nobody?
It means book.
Yes. Yes. And the Bible is not just any book. What kind of book is it?
Religious book.
It is religious.
That's all I know.
We say the Bible.
The book of God.
Okay, good. Let's take it in two parts. It's not just any book, it's the book. And of course, if you're a believer, it is the book. Nonetheless, even if you're not a believer, what is the line in the introduction to the Oxford edition of the King James Bible, which is what we were reading? It says, the Bible is the basic book of our civilization. And to be honest, whether you're a believer or not, the Bible and in its point of view, its stories, its commandments have been so influential on the planet that it really encompasses, there is no part of the globe that has remained completely untouched by the Bible. In the same way today that there's no part of the globe that's completely untouched by science, or no significant part of the globe, the scientific worldview. So Bible means the Bible. And when we think of the Bible, we think of the book of God, and we think of a story that has some kind of supernatural element in which God is directing things. And of course, we think of the Christian and Jewish and Islamic religions in connection with that. The interesting thing, Homer is the Bible for the Greeks, but I mean it here in a more general sense. But equally as important, that Homer was the book for the Greeks, explaining themselves to themselves, explaining the world around them to them, explaining what it means to be a Greek and how one carries oneself in the world, what one should aspire to, what one should admire, what one should admonish and not respect, right? So for example, let's just take a simple comparison of Alcinous on the one hand and the suitors on the other. We talked about how the Homeric tales, epic poetry, is designed to please and instruct, to provide us pleasure, enjoyment, entertainment, but also to instruct morally about how one should live. And it does that a little different from the Bible. I mean, the Bible has stories that show you things, but there are also commandments that say, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. In Homer, you don't have any thou shalt nots coming from God. Uh, all you have is depictions of action, and you see good depictions of human character and depictions of bad human character. So Alcinous really seems, and Odysseus too, but Odysseus is something more like us. He's a little more flawed. Alcinous is this kind of almost perfect king. He doesn't do anything that's supernatural or that's impossible to achieve, but he is this commensurately excellent human being, and that also seems to be why he's such a good king. And you see his personal identity has a direct connection with his political identity as a ruler of his people. And we can imagine that if Odysseus was home ruling over his kingdom, that he would rule something like Alcinous would. If Telemachus could be king, we could imagine he would rule something like Alcinous. And of course, in some ways, while Odysseus is this hero, in some ways he's not as good as Alcinous, because the very fact that he's on this journey is a product of some type of character flaw within him that has prevented him from getting home in a more timely fashion, right? And then there's the specter of this question raised by Tiresias in the underworld of Hades. Even if you get home, if you curb your desire, you may get home too late. You may get home too late. Does anyone remember reading that? I think I quoted in the questions. Tiresias says, who's Tiresias? Do we remember? Did we read it? People were on spring break.
He's the one in the kind of like in that area where the souls are.
Okay, good. So he's in Hades. He's in the underworld. It's kind of like hell, but it's not quite as vicious as like the Christian hell is. And of course, he meets Odysseus. This is like the farthest point in his journey from reality. He's in the underworld as a live human being as opposed to a dead one. He meets his mother, who dies from the grief of his loss, and he meets Achilles, and he has questions. And Achilles states that, he'd rather be alive as a slave than dead as a hero, because he'll take life over a glorious death, which of course the deal he made with the gods was that he would take a glorious death over a long and boring life that would not be remembered. And he's remembered precisely because of the heroic deeds he performed. So Tiresias is a prophet. What's a prophet?
Look like it
Someone
can
who
pre-
delivers,
Pardon?
like a messenger, like a deliverer who delivers stuff.
it can
Yeah,
and
he delivers stuff, but he doesn't deliver pizzas. What does he deliver?
it can predict the future.
Yeah, he can. He kind of predict the future because
Yeah.
for the if we understand what he delivers, what does he deliver? What is he a messenger of? A prophet.
He delivers like the messages about the future and the past and like that
Yeah, and where does he get the messages from?
From
from the
God.
gods.
Yeah,
From God.
yeah, it's not from a what is it? I can't think of any of the food services where you order online. He's not getting messages from food
Grubhub.
services online. What's that?
He's not getting messages from Grubhub.
Yeah, or Uber Eats or something.
Uber
like that.
Eat.
Right, he's getting messages from God. So let's just be clear. The very idea of a prophet is one who is a mouthpiece of God on earth. The gods existing even in the Greek theology or the Greek pantheon. Um, the gods are very corporeal in one sense. They're very embodied. They're very human. They're very flawed. Zeus and Poseidon and all these characters. And yet they still exist on Mount Olympus in a realm that's something other than our flesh and blood material realm. So they need mechanisms like Hermes. So we saw Hermes come down from Mount Olympus to deliver a message to Calypso. He's literally the messenger god. Hermes is literally the one who delivers divine messages and puts them in mortal form so human beings can understand them. So a prophet is a mouthpiece for the gods here on earth. And sometimes the things they say don't make perfect sense because there's something lost in translation from when they come from God's, super sensible mouth to our mortal realm, right? And it should be remembered, the opening lines of the poem, when we look at this next class, sing to me of the man, O muse, right? Homer here is at the very least rhetorically, if he's not totally sincere, is saying that I am essentially a prophet presenting you this story. I am not, this story is not mine. This story comes from the muse, Calliope, who turns out to be the muse of epic poetry, right? And that he is just a kind of vehicle or mouthpiece for the inspiration given to him by the muse, who's this daughter of Zeus, who is really the one with the content of the story. Well, we'll look at that next week. So Tiresias tells Odysseus's men two really crucial things, partly designed to advance the plot and build up our expectations, going in the same way the very first page does. He says that you and your men will not make it home unless you're able to curb your desires. And if you remember in the first 2 pages of the text, it talks about Odysseus's men did not make it home because of, quote, the recklessness of their ways, the recklessness of their ways. And Odysseus is also involved in that recklessness. He just happens to be less reckless than his men and make it home. And this issue of recklessness and curbing one's desires is central to the picture of human nature that we're going to talk about briefly in just a minute. But Tiresias says something in addition. He says, not only must you curb your desires, he says, even if you manage to what's the catch here? If you do not curb your desires, you will not make it home. And then he says a little caveat. He says, even if you curb your desires, you still might come home, quote, too late, too late. Let's start with the first part. What does Tiresias mean by Odysseus and his men must curb their desires? What are we talking about?
They can't eat the cows.
Okay, so the primary example that's given has to do with not eating the cattle of Helios, right? So they go to this island where the sun god lives, or at least it's his island, and he has his cattle there, the cattle of the sun. And Tiresias gives them said, if you want to succeed, you and your men cannot eat the cattle, full stop, or dire consequences will ensue. So that's the most direct example that illustrates this issue of curbing desires. But of course, there are many, many others. And for Odysseus, for his men, that's the most important one because, well, what's the problem on Helios's island? Let me ask a more simple question. Do Odysseus's men eat the cattle of the sun? Do Odysseus's men eat the cattle of the sun?
We do, yeah.
Honestly, I don't
Absolute-
think so.
Pardon?
They slaughter it.
Absolutely. And what do they get in payback for? Remember, it's all about exchange, host and guest. What's their payback for eating the cattle of the sun?
They all die.
Yeah, they all die, and they all die in different ways, like shipwreck, or they get eaten by the six-headed monster
Yeah.
for like as like a little treat, right? And there's a whole variety of ways that they gruesome ways that they get killed, and ironically, some of them get eaten. So it's kind of a reciprocity in play there. But let's step back a second. So that's a great example of this issue of his men failing to curb his desire. Why is it that Odysseus is the only man from his crew to come home? Because he is the only man who curbed his desire sufficiently. It's not to say he does it perfectly throughout. In fact, many of the problems that he creates for himself are directly the product of failing to curb his desire. And so there are many examples. What does it mean to curb your desire? What's that, Larry David? Curb your enthusiasm. What does it mean to curb your desire? If you understand why that's an example of curbing your desire, you should understand what it means to curb your desire. It's not the way we'd put it today.
Would it be like not giving into your temptations?
Yeah, exactly. So to curb your desires is to restrain your desires. And you know what? I've never looked up the word curb, but if you think about what a curb physically does on a road, it literally restrains your vehicle from going off the road. And so curbing your desires, the best way to think about it is, Jessica, you want to say it again?
Not giving into your temptations?
Yeah, so not giving into your temptations, curbing your impulses, restraining your impulses, restraining your passions, your desires, your kind of instinctual gut uh, things that you would like to have, and curb. What's a good synonym for curb?
Redirect.
Okay, redirect. Actually, that's like very Freudian. So like that's like sublimation in Freud, where you have these animal impulses and you have to redirect them from less from bad objects of desire to better objects of desire. What else? What do they have to do here? What's a synonym for curb?
Resisting.
Yeah, resist. And I think maybe the best kind of translation is they have to have self-restraint, or you might call self-governance, right? Human beings live in a world where there are moral rules of conduct. We saw this in Genesis. And the funny thing about the moral laws of conduct is that they can be broken. And the history of moral analysis of why people break the rules, one of the most basic observations is people break the rules because they fail to restrain themselves. They fail to govern themselves. They fail to have self-government or self-restraint, or you could say self-control, right? The cookie jar is sitting there and someone has told you don't have a cookie, but it's just sitting there and you don't see any police officer there to prevent you from having it. So you have the cookie, right? So you give in. And, you know, the problem of human nature, and this picture of human nature, which we'll talk about more in just a second, is that we have impulses that if we acted on them would not be good for us. And how do we know that the impulse is not good? Well, at least in the context of the Bible, it's really clear, because an impulse that gets you killed is not the best impulse. That's kind of like a no-brainer, right? But the problem is we have to have the ability, the courage, the wherewithal to restrain impulses that we know are not good for us, right? And that's, of course, a challenge. And one of the perverse things about human nature is that very often we know very clearly that something is not good for us, and yet our desires impel us toward that object of desire nonetheless. And it illustrates something really complex about a human being, which is that we have multiple desires within us that are pulling us in different directions, right? So like Plato, in a book called The Laws, he has an image of the human being as like a puppet, where different, you know, puppet, like a marionette with strings on it, like multiple strings, and the multiple strings represent different desires we have within us, which we'll look at in a moment. And what's the problem with those desires? They don't all pull us in the same direction. Number one, they don't all pull us toward the right course of action, and they're in conflict with one another. And they're different types of desires. However, what's the catch on the island of the sun in terms of why do they eat the cattle? Did anyone catch that? I mean, if you read, you should have caught that. Why did they just want to break the rules? Did they just want to rebel? I mean, they start to become wary of Odysseus's authority, right? There's an interesting model here where Odysseus, as the more reasonable and the wiser man among his men, he performs the function of keeping them in line. He's not just another guy with them. He's a general. He's a commander. And by commanding them, partly what he is doing is not just telling them what to do, but keeping them in line when maybe they start to get unruly or undisciplined, right? So he's playing that role of restraining them mentally or psychologically, because they're not always capable of restraining themselves, right? I suppose that's why you have leaders in the first place, at least one of them. Why do they eat the cattle of the sun? Are they just trying to be rebellious? Are they just trying to say, the heck with it all, we're going to do what we want? There's a twisted catch to this whole thing of them eating the cattle of the sun.
Oh, weren't they like hungry and exhausted?
Yeah, they were hungry. How hungry were they?
Are they like starving?
Yeah, they were like starving, right? And there was like no other food. And they're persisting on this island with no other source of food. So the longer they sit there on that island, they start looking at that cattle and their eyes get bigger and bigger and they go, food, food, right? And of course, think about the idea of self-restraint or curbing your desire. Curbing your desire means that you control an impulse or an instinct, right? What's the problem with wanting to eat? What's the function of wanting to eat? I know it sounds like a funny question, but what's the function of the instinct for food?
Survival.
Yeah, self-preservation, survival. So the notion of curbing the desire that keeps you alive is rather problematic. So you see that the situation that they get thrown into is like a catch-22, or I think today there's an expression, a Hobson's choice, where whichever one you choose, it's a bad option, right? A kind of a dilemma. By definition, a dilemma is where you're faced with a choice and neither answer is good, right? And the problem is wanting to live is not really a choice. It's part of your fundamental impulse. And every moral code dictates that you have, almost every moral code dictates you have a right to try to preserve yourself in a reasonable way. So it's no surprise that they eat the cattle of the sun. It's not exactly their fault. It's a kind of catch-22 situation they were put into that they really have virtually no alternative. I don't know, maybe they could have held out just a little bit longer and something would have come along. But of course, that's like a counterfactual that you don't get to see in the text. Okay, so they failed to curb their desires. Can anyone think of any, and the consequence is death ultimately, because it's foretold to them by Tiresias. If you fail to curb your desires, you will not make it home, aka that's a euphemism for being dead. What instances can you think of where Odysseus failed to curb his desires and it had particularly negative consequences?
I forgot the name of the god, but wasn't there one god that like after they turned back to normal from being pigs, he fell in love with her and like he didn't want to leave her for a year?
Okay, so that's a great example. And I mean, she tries to cast a spell on him and he has been given the strategy to avoid it, but he still stays with her. She's irresistible. And of course, that prolongs their journey when you think he should be spending his time getting home. So that's a good example. Other examples of where Odysseus fails to curb his desire, and it results, you could say, in a setback of the journey. Let's ask this. What's the big reason why Odysseus has taken so long to get home?
Because of Poseidon.
Because Poseidon
Sorry.
is, at every turn trying to met out revenge and vengeance on Odysseus for doing what?
Blinding his son.
Yeah, blinding his son. Now, so let's put it this way. This blinding his son is at the center of the prolongation of the entire journey. And it has something to do, again, with curbing his desires. What was the real problem? Does anyone remember the real problem? It wasn't just that he blinded Polyphemus with the big log. It's almost like a tree trunk that they sharpened and heated up in the fire and then shoved it in his eye while he was drunk. That in and of itself wasn't the real problem. What did Odysseus do to bring Poseidon's wrath down on him? Let's put it this way. How is it that Poseidon knew that it was Odysseus who did this to his son?
You speak to him about it.
Pardon?
You speak to him. You told him his true identity.
Very good. So we'll look at it in a moment. What did Odysseus say about who he was? So remember that Zenia involves this kind of polite exchange, this ritual of gift exchange, of gifts, of speech, of good manners, of good conduct between one another. And of course, one thing it involves is speech, particularly in the form of asking and answering questions, particularly about who you are. And of course, the whole process of Zenia is determined to kind of illustrate who you are, or for people to be able to discover who you are. So Polyphemus says, "Who are you, strangers?" Right? And what's Odysseus's answer?
Nobody.
Yeah, I'm nobody.
Nobody.
And then, yeah, so this great line. And so you see Odysseus, he's clever, he's cunning, he's sneaky. He also has a sense of humor, right? Um, how does this name Nobody play out in the story on the island of Polyphemus? What happens once they blind Polyphemus?
Doesn't he start screaming like, "Oh, nobody attacked me" and stuff like that?
Yeah, he says, "No, help, help! Nobody is attacking me. Nobody has blinded me." And
Yeah.
therefore, what do all the other Cyclopes on the island? What do?
Nothing.
Yeah, they do nothing because
Do
they say,
nothing.
"Huh, I guess nobody's doing nothing to you, so we're gonna go back and eat our cheese and take a nap or some such," right? But then, as Odysseus's men get back on their ship to leave the island of Polyphemus, what does Odysseus do?
He tells him his first name, his actual name.
Okay, he tells him who he is.
Yeah.
And the question is why, and what does this have to do with curbing one's desires? Why does Odysseus say who he is? He's been undercover as nobody, and his undercover identity has gotten him through. His ingenuity has helped to compensate for the fact that the Polyphemus is physically much bigger and much stronger than Odysseus and his men. And the only way that they can solve that conflict is to use their ingenuity, their wits, their wherewithal. Another aspect of Odysseus. He's very resourceful, clever. He's kind of like the MacGyver of nobody knows who MacGyver. I guess there's a new version of MacGyver. The question, though, is given that his undercover identity as nobody worked so well, why is it that he says his name to Polyphemus?
Is it because he's finally like confident again on who he is and is like ready to return home?
I think so.
Yeah. So
Me too.
Julio says Odysseus's arrogance got in the way. Let's do this for a second, since this is really a central moment in our story. Let's actually look at it. All right, what is the sharing right now? Please resume. Okay, there we go. So let's go to the end of this book. And oh, come on, computer. Oh, sorry, 1 second here. So we've got it, I think, right here. So our question is pretty simple. Why does Odysseus tell Polyphemus his name, and what's the consequence? Once Odysseus tells Polyphemus his name, then we know who the criminal is, and then Poseidon is able to come after the criminal and get vengeance for the son that he has harmed, right? But up to this point, Polyphemus, remember, he's blinded. Remember, he can't see Odysseus. So only through Odysseus telling Polyphemus his name is Polyphemus going to find out. Why don't we just read? And so the question is, why does Odysseus give his name? That seems rather foolish, right? And the key thing here is this ties directly into the theme of curbing one's desires or failing to curb one's desires. And the question is, what is the desire specifically that compels Odysseus to say his name, right? And Julio might be onto something here. Could I have a volunteer read, starting with that made the rage of the monster boil over? Could somebody read for us? Who would like
Can
to
you,
read?
Professor,
I
but can you
can-
make
I
it
can.
bigger?
I can, yeah.
I can read, Professor, but I'm at Bryant Park. I don't know if that's a good idea.
Okay, well, maybe that's not a good idea. Bryant Park. Oh. Okay, who can read who's in a nice quiet place? Oh, come on, folks. Riviera, can you read?
Yes, I can read.
Okay, great.
Okay. You want me to read the paragraphs that are highlighted?
Yeah. Starting at the bottom left.
Okay. That made the rage of the monster boil over. Ripping off the peak of a towering crag, he heaved it so hard the boulder landed just in front of our dark prow, and a huge swell reared up as the rock went plunging under. A tidal wave from the open sea. The sudden black wash drove us landward again, forcing us close inshore, but grabbing a long pole. I thrust us off and away, tossing my head for dear life, signaling crews to put their backs in the sore, escape grim death.
Okay, great. So just a couple observations here. Remember, Polyphemus is a giant, and when he picks up a rock, he's picking up like a gigantic boulder that he throws in the water, and then it makes that kind of ripple effect described as a tidal wave, and it washes the ship. What direction does it wash the ship back in? Which way does the ship get moved when the tidal wave hits the ship?
To the island?
Yeah, just as they're trying to escape
Yeah.
away from the island in the direction of, let's just say, Ithaca in the general sense, right? Somewhere out there is Ithaca, right? The rock makes the tidal wave wash the ship back in to Polyphemus's island. So at this moment, they have every reason to kind of batten down the hatches and just let's get on our way. We got to go. We don't want to be around for this anymore, because even though he's blind, he still seems for some reason to have pretty good aim. Maybe he can hear things. The other thing is the tidal wave washing the ship back in is really symbolic of this journey is always kind of like, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And it's really, we'll see it next week, a kind of metaphor for life. Life does not happen in a linear, progressive, direct way where life just goes from point A here to point B at the end of my goal, my destination of my life. We have detours. We can go this way and that. Sometimes we go forward in our life, and sometimes in psychology, it's called like regressing, right? And so the same thing that's happening physically also happens psychologically, which is the characters develop, they get more mature at some moments. And then in other moments, they seem to regress. And as they regress in terms of their behavior, the journey regresses and takes them back, takes them a step back, takes them one more step away from getting home. So important metaphor. And of course, there's a really interesting question. If this whole story is one about Odysseus and his psychology and his development as a character, there's a question about how much does Odysseus really change in this story? And different scholars have different opinions about whether they think Odysseus has really evolved as a character or whether he's just kind of the same guy who managed to restrain himself in the right moments. Okay, you want to keep going, Riviera?
Yes, I can. They threw themselves in the labor, rowed on fast, but once we had plowed the breakers twice as far, again I began to taunt the Cyclops. Men around me trying to check me, calm me, left and right, so headstrong. Why? The Rile the Beast again? Why the Rile the Beast again?
Okay. Okay, let's stop right there. So remember, how is this story being told to us? How are we getting this story as the reader? Does anyone remember? Is Homer telling us this story?
Is it Odysseus telling the story?
Yes, Odysseus is telling this story. And for the most part, once you're in the framework of the story being told, you kind of forget that he's telling it. But there are moments like these questions where he's contemplating his own actions. He says, so headstrong. He's talking about his own behavior. He says, why? Why rile the beast again? Right? And what has he been doing? He wants to taunt the Cyclops, right? And his men are trying to check him. What does it mean to check him? They're not putting a mark on him. They're not trying to checkmate him like in chess. What does that mean?
Check how he's feeling?
Actually, no.
Put tabs on him?
Yeah, when put tabs on him, yeah, like when people go out and drink together or something. What is the three branches of government? They're designed to check and balance each other. What does it mean to put a check one branch on the other?
To make sure that everything is good?
It could be. It can have that effect. But what specifically is a check? Or what does it mean when you check somebody?
Like make sure they're not going out of line.
Yeah, I mean, literally to block, to stop, to inhibit, to prevent, right? So Odysseus is acting out. He's taunting the Cyclops, right? His impulses, and we'll get to the specific impulse in a moment, but his impulses are getting the better of him, and he's not able to curb his desire himself. He's not able to restrain himself by himself. So his men have stepped in to try to restrain him. And we can see just how bad, or we might just say how stupid or reckless this taunting is, because we've just seen the description of this gigantic boulder being thrown at the ship. My goodness, Odysseus is risking all his ship and his men to be destroyed and drowned simply because he has the need to taunt the Cyclops, right? And so here's a great moment where we see the kind of I don't want to use the word vulnerability, but the imperfection of Odysseus, the kind of immaturity of Odysseus, that he's willing to risk the destruction of he and his men because he has to taunt the Cyclops. And the response is perfect. He raises this rhetorical question: why would you rile the beast again? What's meant by that? Riling the beast. What are we talking about here? Who's the beast?
Poseidon.
Yeah, Polyphemus is the beast. What does it mean to rile him? It's like you rile someone up, right? You know, everybody.
Get him
Provoke him?
Yeah, to get him angry, to get him agitated, to incite him. And what happens when you incite this beast? What's he going to do?
You're gonna react?
Pardon?
You're gonna react?
Yeah, but more specifically, how? Totally, I agree. He's going to react.
He'll attack.
Pardon?
Well,
He's gonna attack.
Yeah, he's going to do something. He's going to try to do something violent toward his men. He's going to attack them somehow. And we've seen this from the get-go of this interaction between Polyphemus and Odysseus and his men, which we'll look at in a moment. Okay. Riviera, why don't you keep going here?
Okay. That rock he flung in the sea just now, hurling our ship to sorry, I can't pronounce S that well. Soar once more. We thought we'd die on the spot. If he had caught a sound from one of us, just a whisper, he would have crushed our heads and ship timbers with one heave of another flashing, jagged rock. Good God.
So great. So notice, right? As long as they keep quiet, they should be fine, right? And you also notice how Odysseus is not just narrating the story here. He's also providing editorial. He's providing commentary. He's providing a kind of analysis of events for us. You want to keep going?
Good God, the brute can throw. So they begged, but they could not bring my fighting spirit around. I called back with another burst of anger, Cyclops, if any man on the face of earth should ask you who blinded you, shamed you, so say Odysseus, raider of cities, he gouged
Yes.
He gouged out your eye,
Laertes.
Laertes' son who makes his home in Ithaca.
Okay, great. So they begged, but they could not bring my fighting spirit around, because he's telling this story in the first person, you see, and he's giving more commentary. Who is the they who begged? Julio, thank you. His men. And what are they begging for? Let's just be crystal clear. What are his men begging for?
For him to stop.
To stop, they want to go home.
They're saying, "Hey, boss, let's get out of here. Let's
Yeah,
go.
They want to get out here.
We don't want to mess with this guy." Well, we'll also discover that their very being on the island to begin with, in the way that they were, was also the result of Odysseus failing to curb his desire. And so notice how it's framed. They could not bring my fighting spirit round. Like they couldn't turn it. They couldn't prevent it. They couldn't curb it. Right. So it's something about in him psychologically. The question we asked was, why does he give his name? Why? We know that he does. The question is why. Has something to do with his fighting spirit. And this has to do with a part of his soul. He said he's angry, right? And we're going to look very specifically in a moment when we look at this model of human nature that Homer and the Greeks are working with, that there's a part of his soul that is the instigator of anger and demands recognition from the world. So he says, Cyclops, if any man on the face of the earth should ask you who blinded you, shamed you so. So this is, he's humiliating him. He's taunting him. He says, say Odysseus, raider of cities. He is the one who gouged out your eye. And I am son, Laertes' son, who makes his home in Ithaca. So he leaves his bloody calling card here. It's like he's leaving his social security number and his home address and all his passwords. That would be like the equivalent today. He's giving like all the identifying information to clarify exactly who he is. So the question is, why does he give it all? What's the purpose? It has something to do with his confidence. Absolutely. Excessive confidence makes people foolish, right?
Yeah.
But what specifically is he gaining here by doing this? There's something that he wants, right? And that's why he's doing it. And Vanko, it has something to do with his pride. What does he want?
Recognitions.
Yeah, he wants recognition that this being who is the product of a god, that he has humiliated it and he has shown that he is the superior being. Because remember, Polyphemus in the cave, he thinks he knows that he's superior because he knows that he's bigger and stronger, and everybody else knows that too. And he thinks simply because he's physically bigger and physically stronger that he automatically has the advantage and that might makes right. Now, the funny thing is, in this world, might kind of does make right, right? It's the kind of the law of the jungle. The problem is physical strength is only one kind of might. And it turns out that Odysseus, while he has all those physical attributes of you'd associate with a kind of mythic superhero, he's very intelligent, and some of the decisive feats that he accomplishes are not with brawn, but with brains. And the way Odysseus is able to solve the problem of Polyphemus's strength is through his intellect, a certain type of use of his intellect. We said he's resourceful, he's clever, he's cunning. And so Odysseus is now going to Polyphemus and saying, I am showing you who really has the might and what kind of might it really is. And I want to be recognized for my superiority. This is very Greek and very different from the world of Job and the Bible, right? The Bible preaches a certain type of humility. Well, of course, this story is teaching a bit of humility too, because he suffers some negative consequences for what you'd call his hubris. And hubris is a kind of excessive pride that leads to one's own downfall, right? Because you need to know your limit and you need to learn to restrain yourself. So he wants to be the one known for doing this to Polyphemus and take credit for it. I mean, notice something interesting here. If you see right here, you have Odysseus. Oh, that's not going to do it. Odysseus, raider of cities, right? And this expression, you see like Athena, daughter of Zeus, Telemachus, daughter of or son of Odysseus, the resourceful Odysseus, the wily Odysseus, the much suffering Odysseus, and Odysseus, the raider of cities. So this is what's called a Homeric epithet. And the epithet is literally the little phrase after or before the noun, the proper noun, that's a little descriptive phrase about the person that's really a kind of extension of their name. And what you'll notice throughout the text is that these Homeric epithets change depending on the context. So here, Odysseus doesn't describe himself by the fact, he does mention he's Laertes' son, but the primary epithet is not Odysseus, son of Laertes. The primary epithet is Odysseus, raider of cities. What is a raider of a city? What is that called to mind? Like what does a raider of a city do? You think of like the Los Angeles Raiders, same word, same name, same connotations. Or are they in Las Vegas now? What's a raider of cities? Shakura says they cause destruction. What's a raider of a city? What's the word we might use for it?
Criminal.
Yeah, I mean, basically like a pirate who's come to kind of, instead of on the ocean, although they are on the ocean a lot, like you raid city, you come and you try to, you're not trying to conquer it for any specific military objective or for spreading democracy around the world. You're conquering it for self-interest, for your own benefit, to get the spoils of combat. And of course, these men, they don't get a paycheck from the government. There's no government to pay them. So where do they get their salary from? They get it from being allowed to raid cities and steal from them, kind of, you could say, rape and pillage. And they make off with their bounty, and that is their kind of reward for fighting, and that is the symbol of their own status as a warrior. So it's interesting, like the idea of a trophy. You know, you win a contest and you get a sports trophy. The original idea of a trophy is literally the armor that you would win having defeated an enemy in battle. So you'd kill them, and then you take their armor, and the armor, the helmet, their sword, their shield, what have you, would be the trophy. So, you know, Odysseus as a hero, and we'll talk a little bit at this next week, the idea of a hero. I mean, here as a hero, his main function is to raid cities for the glory of being able to do it. And in a strange way, it's kind of celebrated here. Now, of course, in the world when this story was actually being told, the world of ancient Greece when this story was written down was very different than this world here, in the same way that in the 20th century, Americans watched Westerns of what? The Wild West. Why was it the Wild West? Because there was no law and order. There might have been a sheriff, but he just sat in his chair and you know, took shots of whiskey or something. And every now and then he put on his badge and went out. But basically every man had to make his own law, and you're kind of on your own in a kind of wild world where the rules weren't defined except by you yourself making them and enforcing them. And the world of the Odyssey is really in many ways much the same, as that same kind of fascination with a world that's less structured and regimented by rules and by the strictures of society. And here we see this Odysseus character, this kind of free spirit, kind of thing that we can't, just like we see the gunslinger. It's an image of a world that we can't engage in anymore in our highly structured, civilized society. Okay, so his own arrogance is his downfall. And so this incident of his pride, his desire for recognition, this is the central cause of the prolongation of his entire journey, right? And until he finally gets home. And while I switch this thing up, remember, Tiresias, the prophet, said something else. He said, you will not get home unless you curb your desires. And even if you do curb your desires, you may come home late. You may come home late. What does that mean, to come home late? Odysseus never phoned his wife or sent a text message and said, honey, I'm going to be home for dinner at 7:30, so have it on the table, please. Right? Have the table set, have dinner done. How could Odysseus possibly come home late, given that there was no timetable in which he was supposed to come home in? Any thoughts about that?
I guess before his home is not like what it used to be anymore.
Okay, so perfect. So before his home is not what it used to be. Can we flesh that out? What would it look like if it's, quote, not what it used to be? What is it going to look like? What's the consequence?
Ithaca kind of became chaos state. It could be like a lot of problems, I guess.
Well, I think it's kind of in a kind of tempered chaos right now. Like, I don't know, look at the United States where we seem to be in a very chaotic period. It's not like our government is toppled, but God forbid, I have no clue. It's whatever's going on with our national government in Washington, D.C. is very strange. What are the consequences of him coming home late? What, just play out what would happen. Let's say he never got home. What would be the consequences? Sebastian, what would be the consequence if Odysseus never made it back to Ithaca?
Maybe someone else would be kind of like chosen as ruler, or like
Yeah, who? I mean, not a specific person, but what kind of person would become ruler?
just like not the right one for the position. I don't know.
Well, who are the people who could become rulers?
One of the suitors.
Yeah, one of the suitors. So coming home late seems to mean something like coming home so late in the process of what's going on in Ithaca that there's really no chance to undo what has been done, right? Where a suitor is and Penelope will be forced to marry someone if Odysseus doesn't make it home. She understands that and she accepts that. She also has a feeling, despite the fact that she loves Odysseus and despite the fact that she's been trying to hold on to the hope as long as possible, she also understands like life does have to move on at a certain point. She's realistic. Despite her romantic flame that she's managed to hold, she also knows that life dictates certain things that she doesn't have control over. And, what did we say in this portrait of Ithaca in the first couple books? It seems to be, we talked about how we enter in the whole book and media res, in the middle of the thing. And the question is, why in the middle? And one answer seems to be that we get Ithaca at the very precipice of it all changing fundamentally to the suitor's rule, right? I mean, we're on the precipice, we're not there, but we seem to be on the verge of that transformation. And this seems to be the last possible hope, this moment where Telemachus calls the assembly and takes off. This is the last moment where we could get something to rectify the situation. It's like, Telemachus is going to go send word to try to rectify the 2020 election or something like that. Okay. So late. That seems to be late relative to what's going on in Ithaca. We're getting tight on time, and I want to try to go over this very quickly. These are the opening lines of the poem. We'll come back to them next week. The first sentence or two: sing to me of the man of twists and turns. The first thing we see about this book is it's about a guy, and a very particular type of guy. And many of the traits of Odysseus also happen to be general traits of human nature. Odysseus, notice what this says here. You know that this journey is metaphorical as well as literal, or figurative as well as literal. It doesn't say that the journey consisted of twists and turns, because obviously we look at this journey and we say, oh, this is a journey with lots of twists and turns. The book is a book of twists and turns. But here it's the man consists of twists and turns. And it says something about Odysseus and human nature, that human nature consists of twists and turns. And the Greek word that's being translated here can actually mean many different things. It can mean multifaceted. It can mean, it literally, the word is like many-sided, polytropos, many-sided, multiple sides. So it can mean a being, which is to say a human being, that is complicated or complex, a being that is multifaceted, that there are many elements to its nature. And why is the journey of life, or Odysseus's journey, one of twists and turns, in which we and Odysseus are driven time and again? Of course, because we're a being of twists and turns, because we're a complex and complicated being. And it means that our life doesn't go, or the journey doesn't go in a straight line. And so there's a kind of implicit model of human nature at work in this text. The really simple element of it is that, the Greeks understood that a human being, which is to say human nature, consisted of a body and a soul. And a soul was basically our psychology. It was the animating principle of the human being that made them alive and not dead. And then it consisted more specifically of our human psychology. When the Greeks talk about the soul, they're not talking about some magical immaterial substance that flies off to heaven when you die. They're talking about your psychology. The word psychology literally means the science of the soul. The Greek word for soul is psyche, and that's where the word psychology comes from. You take Psych 101, right? So there's a soul and a body, and the soul is supposed to rule over the body. And it turns out that the soul, so the human being is divided in two, body and soul. And then we discover that the soul itself is divided into two. There's a rational part and there's a non-rational part, or you could call it an irrational part, but it's a part that functions without reason. And so you see the course of Odysseus's journey, the course of his life is a kind of fundamental struggle in which reason and the passions. So we talk about non-rational, we're talking about the passions, we're talking about emotions, we're talking about impulses, right? Talking about various types of instinctual appetites. And that the Greeks, Homer and others like Plato and Aristotle, conceived of human life as basically a kind of competition within the individual soul, but also in society as well, in which there's a conflict between reason on the one hand and passions on the other. Uh, and the conflict is over the control of the person's life and actions, right? And the basic model is one that we all recognize, that living correctly in the most general terms, living the right way, involves reason restraining the passions, or at least restraining those passions that are not beneficial to us. And in this model of this tension between reason on the one hand and passion on the other, reason is the part of the soul that can see the consequences of your actions, right? It's very famously said, the passions are blind. Your desire for sex, your desire for drugs, your desire for chocolate, Coca-Cola, whatever it is, that desire doesn't see the consequences of, I don't know, eating too much chocolate or something like that. All it sees is, I want chocolate, right? But it's reason that's able to look at the bigger picture and say, well, if you eat that much chocolate, you're going to be sick, or you're going to be unhealthy, or whatever it is, right? So reason is something like the guide to the soul. It allows us to see what the right thing to do is and make a judgment about it. So if we look, for example, at what Odysseus does at the end of book 9 with Polyphemus, we see that his reason has failed to control his impulses. His reason has failed to control his impulse. His reason has failed to curb his desire, right? Simple as that. Now we get a slightly more fine grained analysis. And these words lurk throughout the text in Greece, that there are two types of passions that the Greeks identify as driving us in our actions. One is called epithumia, and it's translated as appetite. And particularly, it refers to bodily appetites, right? And by bodily appetites, we mean the appetites of the body that deal with things like self-preservation. Like you need to eat, you need to sleep, you need to have sex to reproduce, you need warmth, so you seek out warmth, all for self-preservation. So the interesting thing about bodily appetites is that they pursue needs like shelter and like water and like food, but they also pursue desires that are not necessarily good for you. Like, I want to have a 12-pack of beer, or a whole bottle of wine, or something like that. Or I want to engage in, dangerous promiscuous sex with someone who I don't know while I'm drunk, something like that. So what's reason supposed to do? It's supposed to step in and say, wait a minute, this is not a good decision. I shouldn't want to do this because the consequence will not be good. So bodily desires. Who in this text functions on their bodily desires? Who in this text functions on their bodily desires? Which characters?
Would it be his crewmates? His men?
Pardon?
His men?
Okay, good. So his men, and of course it's understandable why they want to eat, right? But that's a perfectly good example where they're motivated by their bodily appetites and it leads to their own demise. Absolutely. Can anyone give one other example of people who seem to be primarily led by their bodily appetites, or largely led by their bodily appetites? and it's depicted quite graphically throughout the text? Hint, what do the suitors spend a lot of their time doing?
They tried to persuade Penelope into getting married.
They do. And when they're not doing that, what else are they doing? That
They're
it's,
eating all the food and stuff like that.
yeah, they're constantly depicted eating and drinking and drinking and eating and eating and drinking. And you start to get the idea that one of the primary things within their psychology that motivates them is their desire for just physical well-being. So bodily appetite just refers to a general desire for physical material things that are pleasurable for the body, right? And you see that constantly. And it seems to be that their psychology is really driven by that. And we're going to see this play out in the end of the text in a very profound and interesting way. So last one is thumos, or spirit. And thumos is associated with spiritedness and anger. Like you think of team spirit, a football team comes out on the playing field, or soldiers go out into battle and they get psyched and they get pumped and they get aggressive because they want to meet the challenge in front of them. And so spirit is associated with anger, the type of anger that's not like mean anger necessarily, but like a certain type of assertive anger, a kind of aggressivity, right? And so you notice that in that passage where Odysseus calls out his name, it says, "My men could not turn my fighting spirit around." And I think the text is exactly talking about this thing called thumos. And the big thing about thumos is it what it desires. It's a part of the soul, and it desires recognition. It desires honor. It wants its worth. It wants you to be recognized in your worth. It wants you to be esteemed. And if you think about the relationship between you wanting to be recognized and anger, it seems to be the case that human beings get angry precisely when the world or other people do not recognize them properly, do not give them their props, do not give them their respect, their respect, right? So when the world doesn't, we think highly of ourselves, and when the world doesn't think highly of us, we get mad because it hasn't given us what we think we deserve. So Odysseus stands there, calls out his name because he wants to be recognized by all the world for having done this to Polyphemus. So he's motivated by his desire for honor and recognition, which the Greeks call spiritedness or thumos. Okay, we've got, when do we finish up? 35. You know what we should do is we should just pick up with, for the last 10 minutes here, we'll pick up with Odysseus's men on Polyphemus's island. And we'll get to just a few little bits and pieces here. Okay. So this is the moment when Odysseus and his men meet Polyphemus, right? And here it says, a sudden foreboding told my fighting, it says writing, it should be fighting spirit, I'd soon come in contact with a giant clad in power like armor plate, a savage deaf to justice and blind to law. We immediately learned that Polyphemus is deaf and blind to the laws of Zenia. He doesn't care about them. And here we kind of have an example of the way Zenia does not successfully play out on this island. Does anyone remember why they end up encountering Polyphemus at all? Why do they end up coming in contact with Polyphemus? Did Odysseus's men want to stay around to meet the giant who made all the cheese and had all the flocks of sheep?
His men didn't know.
What did his men want to do? They came on the island because they needed food. There's a whole beautiful description of the island at the outset, but they come and they get the cheese. They take some animals and they want to get back on the ship and they want to say, sayonara, let's get out of here. But what happens? Why do they end up staying long enough to meet Polyphemus? Why do they end up staying long enough to meet Polyphemus? Nobody? Odysseus was curious. He was curious. He wanted to stay around. They had seen that this animal was some kind of a giant and some kind of a beast, lived in this very primitive way. And they had seen all the trappings of his island and all the trappings of his life, but they had not seen the beast himself. And Odysseus was determined, out of his own sheer intellectual curiosity, to see what this beast looked like, right? So he was driven not by his bodily appetite. He was driven not by his spiritedness for seeking honor. What was he driven by? He was driven by his rational curiosity. His rational curiosity. And what does it do? It gets him in a lot of trouble. Could someone start reading from right here where Polyphemus says strangers? Who could read for us?
Yeah, sure, Professor, I can read.
Justin, go for it.
Strangers, he thundered out. Now, who are you? Where did you sail from over the running sea lanes? Out on a trading spree or roving the waves like pirates? Sea wolves raiding at will, who risk their lives to plunder other men.
Okay, so notice the first thing Polyphemus does in his failure to perform Zenia is to call them, number one, strangers. And then the next thing he does is ask them who they are. But he doesn't just ask them who they are. He basically says, what kind of criminals are you? What kind of pirates are you? Sea wolves raiding at will. What does this say about Polyphemus? Is this how you're supposed to greet a guest? Is this how you're supposed to greet a guest?
No.
No, why not? I mean, what about it is rude? Let's just say it's rude. What about it is rude?
He's making a lot of assumption. He doesn't know them.
Okay, he doesn't actually know them, and he's made a lot of assumptions about them. I would say, just the way he calls them strangers is, I mean, that's like another way of saying foreigners. That's another way of saying, hey, you aliens, right? We in our own society, we have this tension, like it's impolite or it's politically incorrect to call people who come over the border, in the way they do, aliens, right? Because that's a denigration of their humanity. So he just calls them strangers. He doesn't say you men, right? And then he assumes they're pirates and sea wolves and they seek to plunder other people. So is the first thing you do when you greet your guests to ask them these kind of confrontational questions?
No, at least give them water.
No, not only are the content of the questions very rude, but the good host is supposed to automatically be accommodating and not press the guest on exactly their identity because they have a level of trust. Is there any established from the get-go? Is there any trust established here? Do we have any sense that there's trust between these two parties engaged in a form of Zenia?
No.
Absolutely not. And this is really crucial because when you trust one another, you're willing to engage in the ritual. And we'll see that precisely because they don't trust one another, the ritual is not going to go as planned. Now, he said all these mean things about them being pirates. But excuse me, how have Odysseus and his men acted up to this point since they came from Troy?
Like pirates.
Yeah, the irony here is Odysseus and his men have acted just like pirates since coming from Troy. It's even celebrated. Odysseus, raider of cities, is what he calls himself when he calls out Polyphemus at the end here. And Odysseus, raider of cities, is also the name used when they're, well, they're raiding cities shortly after leaving Troy. So ironically, and of course, why did they come to Polyphemus's island? Because they needed some supplies, with the, what is it? The 5-finger discount in our day. So ironically, Polyphemus is being perfectly honest here. And of course, even if you think about how Zenia works, being polite precisely means not always being brutally honest. Being polite means finding a delicate way to get to the truth without being overly frank or overly direct or blunt in your tactic in getting to know the person. So we see immediately that there's something very different going on this island compared to, say, the island of Alcinous. And in terms of Zenia, Alcinos's palace and Polyphemus's island, they're like inverted images of one another. Okay. Justin, you want to keep going? We'll just read a little bit more.
Yeah, sure, no problem. The hearts inside us shook, terrified by his rumbling voice and monstrous hulk. Nevertheless, I found the nerve to answer firmly. Men of Achaia we are, and bound now from Troy, driven far off course by the warring winds over the vast gulf of the sea, battling home on a strange tack, a route that's off the map. And so we've come to you. So it must please King Zeus's plotting heart. We're glad to say we're men of Atreides, Agamemnon,
very good.
Yeah, whose fame is the proudest thing on earth these days. So great a city he sacked, such multitudes he killed. But since we've chanced on you, we're at your knees in hope of a warm welcome, even a guest gift.
Okay. So he starts out announcing very directly who we are. And then he says, we're here at your knees. And this being at your knees is literally you get down on your knees and grab their legs in a gesture of supplication. It's a kind of gesture of humility and almost kind of begging. So he's saying we're great men of Troy. We fought with Agamemnon. Of course, we know what happened to Agamemnon when he came home. He got killed by his wife's lover, right? And we're now begging you as these great heroic men who fought at Troy, who you must have heard about through the grapevine because we're like famous and stuff. We need a guest gift from you, right? Based on Polyphemus's introduction, do you think Polyphemus is going to give them a guest gift?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. What is the quote unquote gift that they're going to receive?
You're gonna die.
Yeah, the gift they get is they get eaten as for breakfast by Polyphemus. And does anyone remember what Polyphemus promises Odysseus?
He promised him that he'll eat him last.
He says, I'm a really good host. And since I'm such a good guy or a good monster, I'll eat you last. Right? Question. Why does he bring up all this? He doesn't just say I'm Odysseus. He says we're men of Achaia. Those are the Achaeans are Greeks. That's what he means by that. We just came from Troy. We just fought at Troy. I'm sure you read about that in the Iliad. Driven off course by warring winds, so on. We fought alongside Agamemnon. Why is he saying all this? It actually ties in with the conclusion that we read in terms of him saying, I'm Odysseus, raider of cities, and I did this to you.
Make him sound like better.
Yeah, he's speaking to Polyphemus for a certain type of effect, right? He's not just saying this to say it. He's saying it because he thinks it will have an impact on Polyphemus's thinking about the situation. Why does he puffs themselves up? He said, we're the famous guys who fought at Troy. Why does he say this?
Look like you just want to get us some sympathy from.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way: we're heroes, man. You've got to take care of us. We're I mean, my goodness, Zeus and Athena sing our praises. You have to take care of us because we're really important people. You should let us in the club, right? It's like a Friday night in the meatpacking district or something like that. Oh, let's try that. All right, just another minute. Justin, you want to read that last sentence again, and then we'll flip the page? You there, Justin? Okay, I'll read it. But since we've chanced on you, we're at your knees in hopes of a warm welcome and even a guest gift. Of course, they're going to get neither. The sort that hosts give strangers. That's the custom. Respect the gods, my friend. We're suppliants at your mercy. Zeus of the strangers. That's Zenoi from Zenia. Zeus of the strangers guards all guests and suppliants. Strangers are sacred, and Zeus will avenge their rights. Right?
Sorry, Professor, I couldn't read. I had to step away for a second.
That's okay. What, why is he saying this? I mean, it's pretty clear here. He's talking about the custom of Zenia quite explicitly, that this is a divine system of justice. It's, you could say Zeus is the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner of the rules of Zenia. And he's saying you have a divine obligation to perform Zenia for us. If you don't accept that we're heroes from Troy, you must accept that this is the divine code and you have to follow it or you'll be punished. Zeus will avenge our rights, right? How does, just a second longer, how does Polyphemus respond? Does he care about Zeus enforcing Zenia?
No.
No.
He doesn't give two hoots. So I'll just read it. Stranger, he grumbled back from his brutal heart. You know, he's a beast. You must be a fool, stranger, or come from nowhere, telling me to fear the gods or avoid their wrath. We Cyclops never blink at Zeus and Zeus's shield of storm and thunder, or any other blessed god. We've got more force by far. I'd never spare you in fear of Zeus's hatred. You or your comrades here, unless I had the urge. But tell me, where did you moor your sturdy ship? And when you arrived, up the coast or close in? I'd just like to know. Okay, so why does he not care about Zeus's divine code of Zenia? Very quickly, and we'll call it a day here. Why does he not care?
Maybe because his father is a god too.
Yeah, it seems to be that Polyphemus, being a descendant of a god, that he's not obliged to follow the rules of the gods. For example, that this code of conduct of divine justice, it seems to be one enforced amongst mortals rather than gods. Gods can kind of do what they want. He says, I'm as strong as Zeus. Now, I don't know that that's perfectly true, but he says, I have as much force as Zeus and I don't have to follow any of the gods, right? Of course, we discover that if Zeus is not going to take care of Polyphemus for his transgression, Odysseus will. Because in Zenia, when a good deed gets returned for a good deed. And also it's the case that a bad deed gets returned for a bad deed. So if he's going to eat Odysseus's men instead of giving them a guest gift, or if that is the guest gift, he's going to get the same kind of gift in turn as part of the exchange and the reciprocity of Zenia. So he says this hilarious thing after saying, to heck with the gods. He says, but where's your ship? What's that all about? Why is he asking where your ship is? There's 2 seconds more here.
he's probably trying to figure out like if they'll be able to escape, quickly
Yeah,
or not.
so first of all, it shows a total lack of trust, right? And he wants to know whether they'll escape. He may even want to know if there are more human beings on the ship so he can eat them. And in the end analysis, he wants to eat the human beings, whether it's so they don't escape or whether there's more on the ship. And so notice how Odysseus responds to this question. He knows that there's no level of trust established precisely in the way that Polyphemus opened up the entire process here. And Odysseus has given him a chance to be a proper host, and he has not taken that. In fact, he said, I have no obligation to be a proper host. And when he says there's no obligation, their lives are immediately in threat. So this question has nothing to do with being nice, like, oh, let me help you fix your boat or moor it somewhere else. It's, I want to eat you guys. And Odysseus, in retelling the story, says that very clearly. So he laid his trap, but he never caught me. No, wise to the world, I shot back in my crafty way. So this is this wonderful moment in the text where Odysseus curbs his desire to respond to a question, right? Even when we know we shouldn't respond to a certain question that's posed to us, we naturally have the polite mentality to answer the question that's been asked of us. And he realizes if he answers that question that he and his men are in big, big trouble. And so he's figured this out in his mind, kind of rational forethought. And what does he do? If Polyphemus is going to be disingenuous with him, and he's going to be disingenuous, he's going to lie to him right back. So he says, my ship, Poseidon, god of the earthquake, smashed my ship. He drove it against the rocks, and so on and so forth. So of course that's a lie. That's not true. Is Odysseus justified in telling a lie to Polyphemus? There's 2 more seconds here and we're done. Is Odysseus justified in telling this lie? Of course, his ship is not smashed against the rocks.
Probably not, but I think in terms of like saving his life and his people or his men's life, then maybe it is.
Okay, so in terms of our principle against lying, we say, no, that's not the right thing to do. But I think the text presents it in this context where it's very clear that self-preservation is at stake here, and that therefore this lie is justified, not only because their self-preservation is at stake, but also because Polyphemus has demonstrated that he has no interest in following the proper rules of civilized conduct in the guest-host relationship. So all the rules are off the table now, right? And then notice how Polyphemus responds to what Odysseus says, and this is it. He says, not a word in reply to that. The ruthless brute, lurching up, he lunged out with his hands toward my men, and snatching 2 at once, wrapping them on the ground, he knocked them like dead puppies, and their brains gushed out all over, soaked the floor, and ripping them from limb from limb to fix his meal, he bolted them down like a mountain lion, left no scrap. He devoured entrails, flesh and blood, marrow and all. And then we flung our arms to Zeus and we wept and cried because they're more human beings at the mercy of the gods and they need help. So notice this is a big thing. Polyphemus here is an image of this uncivilized brute, despite the fact that he's descended from the gods. And in one sense, he's superior to Odysseus and his men. On another hand, he's inferior because he's a brute. He's a beast. He's an animal with the power of speech, but not with the civilization that comes with human existence, right? And this lack of civilization is perfectly depicted in the fact that he stops engaging in conversation, right? With Alcinous, everything in this ritual of Zenia consisted of various types of conversation. But here Odysseus responds to the question, and instead of Polyphemus saying something else, using words, he responds by eating his men. And he just shows this fundamental disconnect between the status of Odysseus and his men as human beings and their way of life versus Polyphemus and his way of life. So clearly Odysseus is going to have to be just as brutal with Polyphemus if he's going to solve the problem of being stuck in this cave. And of course, let's just, one last thing, one last observation. Odysseus demands recognition of the fact that they're heroes at Troy, and therefore you should give us gifts. He doesn't get that recognition. The recognition he gets is of his men being smashed and obliterated on the ground and their brains smashed out and eaten. Then we can see a little more clearly why at the end of the book, he is so concerned to extract that recognition from Polyphemus once he succeeded in blinding him and escaping him because of the way they were treated when they were first greeted by Polyphemus. Okay. We are finished here. Thoughts, questions, comments? I think Sebastian, you came late, so why don't I mark you down?
Yeah, thank you.
Otherwise, we are done, and I will see everybody next Monday, and the assignment will be up sometime tomorrow.
So, Professor, we aren't meeting this Wednesday, to clarify.
That's correct. We're not meeting this Wednesday.
Okay.
And Roxana, you wanted to chat at the end?
Oh yeah, Professor Smith, I just have a quick question.
Yes.
You know how I asked you for, like, I know you've been really busy and that's why, like, during the break, even though it's a break for us, it also should be a break for you too. I just wanted to, because when I saw that I couldn't submit, I asked for extension, you said sure. I couldn't submit the paper on Turnitin. Do you just want me to email it to you right now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'll email it to you right now. Okay.
Yep.
Right,
Professor?
thank you.
Yes.
I also have a question about that too, because I was unable to submit it because my computer turned off last minute, but I emailed it to you. I was wondering if you got it.
I will, if I should have it, and I will be responding tonight.
Okay.
Thank you, Riviera. Have a great night. She's not here anymore. No, so you will get an email from me tonight, and I'm just going to assume that everything's fine with it.
Yes.
Yep.
Professor?
Sebastian, yes.
Yeah, so I had a kind of like similar issue, but I mean, I guess I didn't get a response either. So should I wait for it tonight or?
Yes. If you sent it, let's just assume it went through, and I'll confirm that I got it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Yep. Okay. What's up,
Hello?
Roxana?
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, I just I was gonna send an email earlier.
Can you wait 1 second? I need to stop the recording.
Okay.
Yeah. 1 second.